I think the one really important decision you should be making on a regular basis is how much can I afford to put into my pension between me and my employer, if I'm lucky enough to have an employer paying in for me, because most people aren't paying enough in unless you're a public sector worker in one of those nice defined benefit pension schemes. You're probably not saving enough, and I think that's the critical metric, is how much you're putting into your pension every month.
This episode is sponsored by Saxo Markets. Welcome to the Investing Insiders podcast, where we help you achieve financial well-being by making smarter money decisions. I'm Brianne Horn, and in today's episode, we'll be looking at pensions, which are financial products which allow you to save for retirement. But there's been a lot of rumours lately about whether or not new proposals in this year's autumn budget could affect the way that you save. Joining me today is pensions expert Tom McPhail. With over 20 years' experience in the pensions industry, Tom has been instrumental in shaping pensions policy in UK organisations across Hargreaves Lansdown, the Pensions Policy Institute and Aviva. He also hosts his own pensions podcast called Pensions Monkey. Tom, welcome to the show and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Now, with all of the speculation going on at the moment, there's been a lot of guidance and tips about what people could be doing with their pensions, and it largely steers towards leaving it as it is and waiting for confirmation. But you've taken a slightly different strategy and have made some big pensions money moves. Can you tell us a bit more about it?
Sure, yeah. And to your point, I agree that for most people, most of the time, it's best not to react to short-term political concerns, to set your long-term strategy and just get on with it. So I think it's important to be clear about that up front. And then I think it's just worth talking briefly about the political context, because over the last 20 years or so, pretty much every year, there's been a budget coming up and the government's been short of money and we've been worrying about what cuts they're going to make or what allowances they're going to take away or what taxes they're going to raise, because that's where the government's been pretty much since the financial crisis of 2008, and particularly in the early years of the coalition government in the early 2010s. There were a lot of cuts to pension allowances. So these things do happen and are real. And I think particularly right now with this government going into this budget, they are really short of money. I mean, not just a bit short of money, they're really short of money. And in addition, we've got a chancellor and particularly her deputy, Torsten Bell, who are quite relaxed. And this is not a political point. They've said so I've read Torsten Bell's book. He used to be the chief executive of the Resolution Foundation. So it's not like they're hiding anything here. They are quite relaxed about taxing wealth. And of course, we heard from Rachel Reeves in the run-up to the election and then the last budget how they were absolutely not going to tax working people. They were the ones protected. Well, you're not going to tax working people, you're going to tax wealth. And to some extent, we saw that with the VAT on private schools and the inheritance tax changes for farmers and so on. So the agenda is very much taxing wealth. And where is the wealth? Well, a lot of it's in pensions. So Torsten Bell himself has talked in the past about capping the lump sum tax-free allowance that you can get at retirement, reducing that significantly. So just to briefly revisit the rules, the maximum lump sum you can take from your pension is the lower of £268,275, so a bit over £250,000, or 25% of your pension savings, whichever is the lower sum. So if you've got £400,000 in your pension, you'd be able to take £100,000 lump sum. Well, Torsten Bell has talked in the past about reducing that to just £40,000. And I don't seriously think he's about to do that, but it's worth noting that the Institute for Fiscal Studies, a respected independent think tank, they've talked about capping the lump sum at £100,000 in the past. And it would be a fairly simple measure for the government to do. So we're going into this budget with a government that needs money, likes taxing wealth, and has actually explicitly talked about reducing this pension lump sum allowance. So for me, at the age of 59, I've been pretty lucky in life. So my pension savings are such that I can't build up any more tax-free lump sum. I'm capped off at that 268,000. So I'm looking at this and thinking, well, on the one hand, if my pension pot keeps growing, I won't get any more tax-free money out of it. Everything that builds up in my pension from now, I'm going to have to pay tax on anyway. So there's that. And then if they were to reduce that lump sum allowance from, say, 268 down to £100,000, well, that's £168,000 extra that I have to pay tax on. And whether it's at 20% or at 40%, that's going to cost me some tens of thousands of pounds in extra tax if I leave it till after the budget and if they change the rules. So I'm starting to think maybe it would be better for me to take my money out of my pension now. And then because I'm only working part-time, I'm not currently using my ISA allowances, and neither is my wife. So if I've got a big lump sum in my bank account that I've taken out of my pension, over the next few years, we can recycle that into ISAs, where the money will then grow tax-free. And then when we want to draw on it, we can take the money out tax-free. So even if they don't change the rules, the way it breaks down is I could be better off by taking the lump sum now and putting it into ISAs. Within a few years, I'd be ahead of the game. If they do change the rules and they reduce the lump sum, I'll be way better off. So for me, it became quite a simple decision that because of my circumstances and because I'm going to draw on my pension soon and because my lump sum is already capped, the low risk strategy is actually just to take the lump sum now.
That's really helpful to kind of see the thought process behind that. And, I guess the important takeaway here is really tailoring your pension strategy to your circumstances. For anybody that's listening who potentially might have, say, a smaller or more modest pension pot, how do you think they could best go about deciding what is the right next step if they are concerned about what could change with the pensions allowance?
Yeah, good question. And I'd suggest the first thing they should do is what I did, which is talk to an independent financial advisor. So even though I've worked in financial services for a long time and I understand pretty well what I'm doing, I still use an independent financial advisor to give me an objective perspective on my finances and to help me with my investment strategies. And I would encourage others to do the same if they're in any doubt. I think the lower you are below those thresholds that I talked about, the more it makes sense just to carry on doing what you're doing. Don't act in haste. We've heard from both from HMRC, the Inland Revenue, and the financial regulator, the Financial Conduct Authority. They've both come out in recent days and said, look, if you do what Tom's doing and you take your lump sum out of it, I mean, they didn't mention me by name, but if you take your money out of your pension and then you try and cancel it after the budget and try and reverse the money back into your pension again, you won't be allowed to do it, right? So this is a one-way street. So first of all, you've got to be over 55 to do it anyway. You can't get your money out under the age of 55. But let's say you're like me, you're in your late 50s and you were thinking about this. Well, the lower your pension pot, the more sense I think there is in just sticking with it and keeping your money in and leaving it there, growing tax-free until you actually need to draw on it. So I think, for most people, it probably doesn't make sense to do what I've done. And there's one other risk I want to highlight, which could yet catch me out, is maybe I've got the idea right, but the details wrong. And maybe the government does come along in a few weeks' time and says, yes, we're going to tax wealth. We're going to cap the amount you can pay into your ISAs. And then I'm stuck there with a big bag of money in my bank account, having taken it out of my pension, and I won't be able to recycle it into my ISAs. So that's a risk as well that I think is worth acknowledging. So, that perhaps is another reason just to, if your money's in your pension already, maybe you're better off leaving it there.
Absolutely. I think that's also just a really valid point. The changes could technically come from anywhere. So I guess it's a calculated risk and, making sure you speak to an independent financial advisor to get some extra tips as well to make sure it's right for you. I guess in terms of the speculated changes to pensions, we've heard a lot of things about, obviously, the pensions allowance potentially changing. Do you see, or are there any other things that you think potentially could come up in November as part of the budget?
It's a good question. And some of these things, I think they'd struggle to implement overnight. I think the lump sum is one thing they could implement overnight, which is one reason why I've acted immediately. But there's other things they could do. They could take away the tax relief, the national insurance relief that employers get on their contributions, which would hit employers and therefore technically not workers. But if from employers, they may find that after putting money into pensions after the budget, they've got to pay national insurance on the pension contributions, which currently they don't have to do. they could change the rate of contribution tax relief. At the moment, whatever income tax rate you pay, that's the rate of relief you get on the contributions going into your pension. So it negates out the taxes up front. They could change that. Again, I suspect they'd struggle to do it overnight. That's probably the kind of thing they'd have to say from the end of this tax year, the rules will change. But they've talked about the amount of tax relief going into pensions as a whole. It's somewhere in the region of £70 billion a year when you add it all up. It's a lot of cheese, right? So it's quite possible they will look at those various allowances and say we just need to further restrict the amount of tax relief we're giving on money going into pensions. And so, I mean, I think the other thing I would highlight, we talked a little bit about ISAs already, but whether it's saving money in pensions or saving money in ISAs, if you're thinking about investing money, if you're thinking about saving money, and you've got that cash available already, to me, it's a no-brainer to do it ahead of the budget rather than afterwards. Because just in case they do decide to restrict those allowances a bit more, I mean, I can't see them making the allowances any more generous. This feels like a one-way street we're going down at the moment. And there's just one other I want to highlight, which is quirky little allowance that allows non-earners. So let's say you've got a couple where one of you is earning an income and the other one isn't. Well, the non-earner still has an allowance of £3,600 a year they could pay into a pension. And that can be quite handy for you as a couple to split your savings across both of you, where one of you is perhaps a high earner and the other one isn't. Well, the low earner can still put money into a pension and still get tax relief on that. Well, there's no logical reason why that allowance exists. It just does. So maybe that's another one they would take away, though it would there are lower earners who would potentially suffer from that as well. So maybe they'd feel that politically that's damaging. But I come back to my earlier point. If you're thinking about saving money in tax privileged vehicles, pensions or ISAs, it probably makes sense to get on with it ahead of the budget if you can.
No, definitely. And I guess this raises like a really interesting question generally about finances. There's obviously a lot of benefit to being quite active with your money. So making a plan and, seeing it through to achieve different financial goals. When it comes to pensions, how involved should people be in terms of, monitoring how their savings are doing? And when things like, speculation come up and potential changes, how much should people be involved in making moves and seeking advice and, taking steps in that direction?
Mostly step away from the keyboard and go and do something more interesting with your life. I think I would say for most people, most of the time, that's the best strategy. So work out, I mean, once a year at least, you should be checking in on your pension. How has my pay changed? What's changed in my life? How much am I paying into my pension? How much has the pot grown? What do my long-term prospects look like? It's worth having those conversations with yourself at least once a year. What does my investment strategy look like? Has anything changed that would affect that? And then most of the time, just ignore what's going on in the world. Once you set your strategy, just go and do something more interesting with your time. I know there are people who like kind of day trading or week trading on their pensions and switching assets and buying individual shares. And I say good luck to them. If you can make money doing that by doing the research, then, good luck to you. I think for most people, that's probably hard to do successfully. Let's put it that way. And the last thing you want to be doing is trying to time the market. You think, the market's high, I'll cash out and I'll go into cash and then I'll come back in a month's time and reinvest. Well, hardly anyone gets that right. It's really difficult to time the market. So that simple discipline of paying money in every month, picking, if you're young, 20s, 30s, you should be in equities. You should be in the higher risk, more volatile funds. It doesn't matter if your investments go down. Don't worry about it. Provided you pick the right kind of investment strategy to start with, just ignore it. Don't worry about it because you're not going to be touching that money for several decades. So those are those kind of simple high-level strategies that I think will serve you well, and worrying about that week to week and month to month probably won't help you. I think the one really important decision you should be making on a regular basis is how much can I afford to put into my pension between me and my employer, if I'm lucky enough to have an employer paying in for me, because most people aren't paying enough in unless you're a public sector worker in one of those nice defined benefit pension schemes, you're probably not saving enough. And I think that's the critical metric, is how much you're putting into your pension every month.
Absolutely. And I guess thinking about retirement income, people often might hint towards the concept of putting some reliance on the state pension. In terms of, future forecasting, how much weight should people give to the state pension when it comes to thinking about, their days in retirement?
That's a really good question. I think it's interesting to note that in the long term, based on the current demographics and on the triple lock and the way the state pension is defined today. So currently the state pension is about £12,500 a year. And it costs the government somewhere in the region of £130 billion a year. Well, if nothing else changes, then just because of the demographics and the aging population, if you fast forward 40 or 50 years, then the cost of the state pension in today's terms will be about £75 billion higher, right? So there's a big chunk of public spending that is going to have to get diverted into state pension. And so I kind of understand young people who might not understand, might not be familiar with all those numbers, the fact that it's going to go from 5% of GDP up to about 7.5% of GDP. Well, yeah, so what? But the point is, the population's getting older, the state pension is going to cost more. Can I trust that it will still be there for me in 40 years' time? And I would answer that yes, it will be, but it's going to have to get modified in order to make sure that it remains fair and adequate and sustainable. And it's that sustainability that is such a challenge, I think, for policymakers at the moment. So there will be changes to the state pension. That's inevitable. But it will still be there in some form, even if it gets modified. I'm not sure that it will ever get means tested. I wouldn't say never. I think the triple lock that many of you will have heard about, that's not going to last forever. But that basic state pension of around 12 or 13,000 pounds a year, paid from somewhere around your late 60s, broadly, I think that model will persist.
Yeah, well, I guess we shall see. It's how everything progresses, but definitely having that kind of dual look at things and making sure that you've got, where possible, some kind of workplace pension scheme or a SIP in place to, complement your state pension, I guess, is really important. This episode of the Investing Insiders podcast is sponsored by Saxo Markets. Saxo provides access to a broad range of global assets through a sophisticated trading platform. You can trade US stocks from as little as $1 per trade and UK stocks from $3 per trade. Please remember that all investing involves risk. The value of your investments can go down as well as up, and you could get back less than you invest. Terms and conditions apply. Visit Saxo Markets to learn more. I guess what would be really interesting to dig into, you've had quite an extensive career across pensions and probably have witnessed quite a lot of evolution so far. It would be great to kind of get your opinion on how pensions have evolved over the time that you've been working within them, and I guess how you kind of see them evolving again in the future.
Thanks. That's a big question. So we've been through this kind of golden age, and I first working in financial services in the mid '80s. So we went through the sort of Thatcherite boom of the stock market, and then through the '90s, most people were members of defined benefit pension schemes, the final salary schemes, very generous. And towards the end of the '90s and going into the 2000s, a lot of private sector employers realized that the cost of those guaranteed pensions was just unsustainable. And so from about the late '90s onwards, all the private sector employers quietly closed down those pension schemes one by one. And now pretty much the only guaranteed pensions available are in the public sector. And there's several million people still working in the army and the police and the civil service and so on. And they're all enjoying these defined benefit pensions. Outside that, in the private sector, hardly anyone is. Now, a great revolution around 2012 was the introduction of auto-enrollment, because the number of people saving in pensions was collapsing and hardly anyone was joining a new pension. It was down to about 50% of the workforce. Well, auto-enrollment has done a great job of getting people back into pensions again, but the problem is they're not saving enough. The default contribution rate for an employee in the private sector means that typically they're saving maybe 6, 7, 8% of their pay. And that's not enough. As a minimum, they should be saving at least 10% of their pay, ideally somewhere nearer to 15% or even 20%. So few people can afford that. So we've gone on this roller coaster ride where we had really good pension provision, and we're somewhere at the apex now in terms of the people retiring today, people in their late 60s. They're the beneficiaries of that really good pension system we had a few decades ago. But we're over the crest of the hill, and we're on the downslope now. And as the years roll forwards, the people retiring into the future will have smaller and smaller pensions. We've stopped the rot through auto enrollment. We've got people back into pensions, but now they're not saving enough, and everyone's experienced the cost of living crisis, and loads of people can't afford to buy a house. So getting those contribution rates up from here is going to be really hard, particularly as the economy is really tracking sideways in terms of economic growth. And the thing that's going to get us out of the hole we're in slightly at the moment is growth. And without economic growth, without people and companies trading goods and services and increasing wealth and paying taxes, without that, we're all in trouble. So we have to hope that our policymakers, the government masters, work out how to stimulate the growth, tax policies, whatever that means that happens. We need to get to a place where most people, and it's never going to be everybody, but most people is saving at least 10% of their pay every month from their early 20s through to their late 60s. And if we don't do that, as the decades roll forwards, we're going to be in a whole heap of trouble again. And I just want to call out one other thing that does worry me, which is that at the moment, most people who arrive in retirement own their own home. It's around 2/3, 3/4 of people own their own home. If you fast forward another 20 years, that proportion will be dropping down towards 50%. And if you own your own home in retirement, that's a huge outgoing that's boxed off. If you're still renting a property as you move into retirement, then you've got a whole load of extra income you need just to pay for the roof over your head. And more people are going to find themselves in that trap. So that's a cause for worry as well. So not only do we need to keep focusing our energy on the pensions crisis, we've got to focus on the housing crisis as well.
Absolutely. And I guess that kind of raises a really interesting question. There often is the age-old debate of, do I prioritize my pension savings or property, getting onto the property ladder? In your opinion, is there one that trumps the other, or is it really just a balance of what might work for that individual at a specific point in time?
So it's definitely more the latter. So yeah, there is no absolute answer to this. I would make the observation that if you can join a workplace pension and get an employer contribution, it's a no-brainer, because under the current rules, the auto-enrollment minimum is, and it's not based on your whole income, but for a lot of people, it will be most of their income. You have to pay in 4% of your income. And then on top of that, your employer, if you do that, your employer has to put in 3% of your income. And then the government will put in 1% of your income in some form of tax relief. So you've got 8% of your pay, at least, or most of your pay, 8% going into a pension, and it's only cost you 4%. So you've doubled your money on day one. Well, there aren't many saving schemes that will do that for you. So
yeah,
it's a no-brainer to join a workplace pension and get the benefit of the employer contribution. It is literally free money. So I would always encourage people to do that. And then after that, start asking yourself, well, if I've got any spare savings budget after that, maybe I should be putting it into a lifetime ISA or an ordinary ISA, or maybe I should be topping up my pension as well. And I think there's no one absolute answer to that question.
No, definitely. And I think that's really valuable to kind of take away, and just, sometimes it is best to take a beat and just think about what works for you. There's a lot of different strategies get thrown around, but at the end of the day, you have to look at your specific circumstances.
Just one thing I'd add to that. So I absolutely agree with you. And I think the one piece of advice I would offer on top of that is make sure you've got a strategy. So the worst thing you can do is just do nothing, right? So if you want to go all in on property, fine, do that. If you want to go all in on Bitcoin trading, not my cup of tea, but good luck to you. If you want to go all in on your pension, great. But the one thing you shouldn't do is just cross your fingers and hope something will come along, because it won't.
That's great advice. I think sometimes we do kind of just, hope for that magic, I don't know, that magic thing that's just going to happen and make everything okay again. But in the world of adulting, you do have to take some steps for yourself. I guess kind of looking at the budget and potentially what could come up if, you were making the rules. What are some of the things you'd like to see in regards to pensions, to help, just ensure that everybody's on the right track to have a comfortable and healthy retirement?
Wow, that's a big question. I think I'd start by making it easy for self-employed people to save for retirement because most of them aren't. The savings rates amongst the self-employed are appallingly low, and I understand why. But we've got to make it easier for them to put money aside for their retirement. So, using the tax system to auto-enroll self-employed people into a savings scheme, giving them an opt-out option as well, so they're not forced to do it. But kind of the line of least resistance is yes, I'm going to save for retirement. I would definitely increase the minimum employer contribution going into pensions. So if you join a workplace pension, I'd have something like a minimum of 10% employer contribution, because that would do a lot of the heavy lifting for us. But in order to do that, we'd probably then have to reduce some of the taxes on employers. And I'm kind of a bit of a free market economist kind of fan. So I would look to reduce corporation tax anyway, and encourage businesses to reinvest and to grow. And so on the pensions front, a higher mandatory minimum employer contribution coupled with lower corporation taxes. And we're recording this on the day of the end of the Conservative Party conference, and I've just heard them promising they're going to scrap stamp duty, which I think is a pretty bold move. And that's the kind of that to me, that's the kind of medicine that will deliver the kind of economic growth that I was talking about earlier.
I think that's like a really interesting mix of things, and I guess we just have to wait and see what actually comes up in November. For people who are, I guess, just really trying to think about what they can do to sustainably save into a pension, regardless of what speculation might come up or potential fiscal changes, what are the best strategies for them to use and make sure that they're, keeping their pensions on the right track?
Yeah, again, if your employer offers you a workplace pension, if there's free money to be had by joining that, start there. If you don't know what you're doing on the investing front, fine, there's a default fund that for people in their 20s and 30s will almost certainly be predominantly an equity-based fund, an international equity-based fund, and that's not a bad place to go. If you want to take the time to research different investment managers and try and pick out a fund that you particularly like the look of, well, good luck to you. But if you're going to do that, also budget for the fact that you need to review that more frequently and keep more of an eye on it. So it's not a one-off commitment where you can just pick a few random funds and then come back 30 years later and hope they've done well. Even if you've gone into the default fund, I would still encourage you to check on your pension, how much it's grown by, how much you're paying in, how it's doing relative to the amount of pay you're earning, and what your projected pension pot looks like into the future. Do that at least once a year, maybe every 6 months if you feel more inclined to do so. But I'm not sure that any more frequently than that for most people is actually necessary. Unless you're going to start picking some fairly esoteric investments, in which case you definitely do need to keep checking on them more frequently.
That's awesome. One question that's just sprung to mind. If you were to go back in time to the beginning of your working life, with everything that you know, what's one pension tip you'd give to yourself?
I was very lucky that when I first joined my first job, I was automatically enrolled into a final salary pension scheme. And I didn't even realize they'd done it for a couple of months until I just noticed there were some deductions on my pay slip. So I'm very grateful for that. And I was only in that pension scheme for a few years. So it wasn't in the end on its own enough to retire on. But that gave me a really good start in life. I could probably have saved a bit more. But actually, we didn't have ISAs back then. It was personal equity plans, which were the precursors to ISAs. But I should have saved more of my pay. When you're young, in your 20s, it turns out you've got a whole load of other things you can spend money on, right? I could probably have got away with leading a slightly less self-indulgent lifestyle and saved a bit more. And actually, because I was in a final salary pension scheme, diverting some of that spare income into a personal equity plan, then became ISAs, would have been the smartest thing for me to do. I've done okay in life, so I'm not complaining about it. But that's the advice I'd give my 20-year-old self.
No, that's amazing. Now we're going to dig into one of your listener letters. If you've got a money question, send it in to podcast@investinginsiders.co.uk and we'll read it on the show. Today we have a question from Andy on TikTok. Andy asks, how much do you think the pension pot should be for the average person when they retire? So I guess based on everything that we've touched on today, it really does boil down to your personal circumstances, looking at, I guess, your expenses and how long you intend to be retired for. There are some estimates out there, but Tom, it'll be great to get your thoughts on, what the average person should be kind of using as their North Star.
Okay, so a couple of rules of thumb. One is you can broadly assume a yield of 4%. So if you've got £100,000 in your pension pot, you can safely assume that you can probably take 4% a year out, £4,000 a year out from that £100,000 as a sustainable level of income. And you might slowly erode that capital over time. You might see it grow a little bit depending on the returns you get on that money. But that's a good rule of thumb starting point. Assume 4%. So then you can think about it in terms of replacement rate. Well, how much am I earning today? And then I could say, well, if I'm earning £30,000 a year today, for example, how much could I live on in retirement? And probably I wouldn't need a full £30,000 a year, but I might need £20,000 a year, 2/3 of that amount. My outgoings will have changed, and maybe I've paid off my house and so on. But so then if I want £20,000 a year in retirement, and I might get a state pension of £12,500 a year if I'm lucky at the age of 67. So that leaves me needing maybe £8,000 a year, okay? Which means I need a pension pot of maybe £200,000 to deliver that £8,000 a year, which on top of my state pension of 12. And so you can kind of work through the numbers like that and come up with something approaching a sensible answer for what kind of pot size I might need to reverse back the income I need. The other way of going about it, which might be more helpful for many people, is there are some really good pension calculators out there now. The Money and Pension Service has one. A lot of pension companies do as well. If you just search up pension calculator, and it's the kind of tool where you can put in your age, when you're hoping to retire, what your current income is, any pension savings you built up today, pull the lever, and the lights will spin round and it'll flash up and say, right, well, this is how much you're on track for. And if you want to change that, this is how much more you need to pay in to get to where you want to go. And I would encourage everybody to go through that exercise from time to time.
Fantastic. And we also have a pensions calculator, which I'll link in the show notes. Also, Andy, if you're unsure about, anything moving forwards with your pension, be sure to seek out independent financial advice to get something specialized just for you. We really hope that helped. And remember, if you have a question that you'd like us to read on the show, please send it in to podcast@investinginsiders.co.uk and we may read it on a future episode. Well, thank you so much, Tom, for all of your insight today. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you.
Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much for joining our Investing Insiders podcast. If you liked the episode, please subscribe and leave us a 5-star review on your platform of choice. For the latest money news and deals, you can sign up to our weekly newsletter at investinginsiders.co.uk/newsletter-page. We've also got a suite of guides, tools, and calculators on our website at investinginsiders.co.uk. You can also keep up to date with us on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you in the next episode.